Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining our platform today, where we are rapidly advancing the cause of constitutional conservatism across the state, flipping the rhino seats in Louisiana, and slowly but surely draining the Louisiana swamp. My name is Chris.
And I'm Danielle, and this is the State of Freedom. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening on your favorite platform. As a reminder, we are on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and pretty much wherever you would love to listen to a podcast, you can find us. We are now also available on YouTube and Rumble. And just so you know, we have some short clips from these episodes now that you can share with friends to introduce them to some of the candidates and some of the topics. So we'd love for you to do that as a way to tease some of these important topics and fantastic candidates to your friends, neighbors, and so forth. So anyway, we will be continuing the endorsement series today with a stalwart of conservatism from the House, Representative Valarie Hodges, who is now running for state Senate in District 13. But before we meet Valarie, let's get into the scripture of the day. It is Psalm chapter 103, verses 11 through 13. And it says, "Higher than the highest heavens, that's how high your tender mercy extends. Greater than the grandeur of heaven above is the greatness of your loyal love, towering over all who fear you and bow down before you. Farther than from a sunrise to a sunset, that's how far you've removed our guilt from us. The same way a loving father feels toward his children, that's but a sample of your tender feelings toward us, your beloved children who live in awe of you." And yesterday, I was listening to this show on Rumble. It's called Elijah Fire, and the discussion was such a needed reminder for me that I need to refocus my affections and reset my gaze on the wonder of the Lord, that I really need to stir up an adoration of the Lord in my own heart. And as I was reading this scripture this morning, it was really speaking to that too. It's just a call to remember the faithfulness of the Lord and to set our hearts and our minds to a place of thanksgiving and the awe of Him for all He's done for us. So I hope it helps you maybe readjust your focus this morning or this afternoon, whenever you're listening to this, and, just shift your perspective to be looking at the Lord and all of the good things He's done for us.
He is indeed always faithful. His love is always towering. That is simply something that we have to remember on a daily basis, that his love is indescribable beyond anything we can ever fathom. In fact, we are the apple of his eye, and that knowing that and absorbing that helps us to be able to proceed joyfully from day to day and not become bitter and not become vindictive in the way that we approach. We should do all things in love and to serve in love. And speaking of someone who serves in love and always approaches her colleagues and her citizens with enormous respect and a spirit of service, is Representative and soon to be, with God's grace and hard work, Senator Valarie Hodges, who is running out in Senate District 13, which is Livingston Parish, here to talk to us for a few minutes this morning about her race. Good morning, Valarie. How are you?
Good morning, Chris. I'm doing great. How are you guys this morning?
Fantastic.
If we were doing any better, probably, Valarie, we would be floating ourselves across a river on a Valentine's Day card. You make me exciting every time I get a chance to talk to you and be around you. I've seen you in the legislature, seen the courage that you've shown standing up for issues that are so critically important to the citizens of Livingston Parish, even when at times you were standing with very few and at times even standing alone for the right reasons and on the right principles. And that is just very powerful witness to us. And I know that you've influenced a lot of your colleagues in the process. Let's start with asking you right now how your race is going out there. I know it's heated, I know it's hot, and I know you're everywhere. What are you seeing out there, and what's the pulse?
Well, I appreciate those kind words, Chris. I really do. And when you say standing alone, I was reminded of that scripture you just read, that the Lord is with us all the time in every place. And so that's the confidence, I guess, that I take, is that I know I'm never alone. Even when I'm, fighting for an issue that
Yeah.
other people may not understand, that I know the Lord is with me. And so that is such a comforting scripture. And in this chaotic time that we're living in, I think all of our family, our listeners need to remember that, to just take the time to shut out the noise and just remember that God is with us. And, the word says, be still and know that I am God. And so that's the place I have to try to stay in, even in this race, because I am working 7 days a week, seems like 18 hours a day, going, shaking hands and meeting new people, seeing old friends, that people that 12 years ago helped me with my race that I haven't seen,
Wow.
haven't heard from. And they came and said, hey, I want to help you again. And so it's really been a blessing to meet all these new people and connect with friends. And so the campaign is going fantastic. The poll numbers are showing the latest poll that I saw. There were several polls that I've just been going up in the numbers, but I think it was 46 to 31.
Oh, wow.
But I'm not taking that for granted. I'm just like, okay, my husband and I used to race cars. My campaign team thinks that's funny, but we did used to race cars at State Capitol Dragway. And so I'm like, no, we're going to put the pedal to the metal, and we're going to push harder than we have had to do before, because it's crunch time. I mean, they're going to send out those mail-in ballots probably next week.
Wow.
And then people can start mailing in their ballots, and then early voting is in like 3 weeks. And we know that it's crunch time, and we really have to push for, to get to the finish line. We can't give up. And so I really appreciate my campaign team coming along, and everybody that has helped me along the way. We started last fall, just getting out there. Chris, you were with us with you and your wife were with us with some of the things that we've done. And I think the poll numbers reflect the fact that, I'm conservative, and I'm not ashamed of my conservative values. And I'm not ashamed to talk about being a Christian and stand for those values that we represent. And I'm so proud of this district that I represent, that I am going to represent, because we are a family-oriented, God-fearing community. And we're not perfect by any means, but it's an honor for me to represent them and meet them, and will be an honor to represent them.
The legislation, Valarie, that you put through successfully this past session really is a testament to the fact that you are a woman of real conviction and not just a talker. I mean, your House Bill 537 that went such a long way in protecting our critical infrastructure from our foreign enemies, that you fought that all the way through, despite ups and downs, and we were there all the way to get that through and to get that signed. Your legislation that allows the Bible to be taught as an elective in public schools in Louisiana, the history and literature of the Bible. Your resolution that requests that the education bureaucrats, the schools, post-secondary and the schools provide reporting on how much of our tax dollars they're spending on things like critical race theory, social emotional learning.
And you were there, Chris, when that happened. And it was stunning to see the fact that all it was asking for was some information of how much you're spending on critical race theory and the diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's all we ask. How much are you spending on it? Because they deny that they're even teaching this. And then what do you expect to accomplish, and how do you expect to measure success? That's all it did. And you saw the reaction that was shocking, to call this the most racist bill he had ever seen. And so it intimidated the two Republicans on the committee, because they didn't want to be called racist, and they voted against it, which was just shocking to me. And that's why it's important to have people with enough backbone to stand up when you're going to be called a name, to not fold at that, because there was nothing racist about this bill at all. And so, but people can throw out those names
It's
and
so
try
true.
to intimidate people, and then you just fold.
It's so
And
true.
that
And
was
we've seen it time and time again. And that's actually something that's come up in this series a lot by bold candidates, that they're not afraid of being called names. And I mean, it's like bullies on the playground is what you're dealing with. And frankly, what we're all dealing with as a members of the public who have convictions that go against what the media tells us we should be thinking.
Exactly.
Valarie, that day when I was down there and I saw the dignified way in which you responded to just the most ridiculous attacks that I think I've ever seen, and even suggestions, sadly, by your own fellow Republicans, which is the very reason why LCAG was formed, is to clean those rhinos out. So real patriots and warriors like you have real allies. But the scripture that came to my mind when I was down there that day and watching you was when Isaiah says that when they attack, I will turn my face like flint, and I will not be ashamed to stand in the assembly and speak for the Lord. And that's what you were doing that day. And you did it with such grace and dignity. And really all it was an exercise of legislative oversight so that you can make sure that you're being a good steward of our tax dollars and making sure that what our children are being taught in school is appropriate for them. But it's that I use that simply as an example. And I could sit here for an hour and talk about examples of legislation that you've sponsored and put forward that really, really shows fidelity to the citizens. And I say all of this to make the broad point that you can tell what kind of a senator you're going to be because you have a track record. You're not just talking. You have demonstrated where you stand and that you will stand for the people. And that is why we are so enthusiastic about endorsing you and why there's such a clear contrast between you and your opponent. And we're going to get into that after we're done interviewing you. But it's just such a privilege to be able to support someone like you and a number of other conservatives in the legislature who give us hope. Frankly, you give us hope that there is a reason to keep fighting.
Yeah, exactly. And Valarie, what are you hearing on the campaign trail? You know, we've closely followed, as Chris mentioned, the legislation that you put forward and the things that you were supportive of this past session and the sessions even leading into this session. But what are you hearing anything different on the campaign trail? What are people concerned about?
Well, I think that most of the people that I'm talking to are mostly concerned about, well, the first thing they're concerned about in Louisiana Parish is flooding because of the 2016 flood. That's the first thing. And the second thing that they're concerned about is infrastructure. And surprisingly, the third thing that I'm hearing is that people are concerned about crime and their safety and their children's safety. And so those are things that I guess that's the biggest priorities. And taxes, high taxes, the cost of living. Everybody is struggling with the high taxes, the cost of everything, inflation. And these are byproducts of having a Democrat governor and a Democratic president who's implemented policies that are horrible for our state and for our nation. And so we're paying the price for that. And so I believe people just can't wait until next year to vote in a Republican president, and we need a Republican governor who's going to roll back some of these really bad tax policy and some of the things that he did in his first term, which was, make it soft on crime is putting it lightly, and let criminals out of jail.
Yeah.
And so we've got to address some of that. I think this is probably one of the most important elections in our history because of what we're facing as a nation and a state. And we can roll back some of these things if we get a good Republican governor and a conservative legislature who's going to support that. And so it's so important that people look at the track record, like you said, Chris, a proven track record versus somebody who's doing a lot of talk. My opponent has posted on Facebook that I never passed a bill, which is just so ludicrous. I was shocked to read that and to see, how many bills I have filed and how many I've passed and how many has been signed into law. Yeah, some of them were vetoed, some of them were sent to Jude, but I filed a lot of legislation, Chris, and you've been there along the way. And I just want to say thank you again for being there during that foreign adversaries bills to stop communist China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Valarie, you passed. It's really interesting to me that your opponent would suggest that you've never passed legislation. You passed the most important state sovereignty legislation, with the possible exception of SCR 21, the nullification resolution of the whole session. I mean, your legislation prohibits our declared foreign enemies, enemies who are declared sworn adversaries by our own State Department, from purchasing those governments, from purchasing infrastructure and land in the state of Louisiana. It is just mind-boggling to me that your opponent would suggest that you didn't pass any legislation. Like I said, I could go on because I know it very, very intricately. I could go on for a long time. But you have to consider the source, Valarie. And like I said, this is going to be positive, you talking about you. But I do have to say this: your opponent, not only do you have a track record which is favorable, he has a track record which is far less than favorable. And we are very familiar with his record in promoting things that are absolutely not in the best interest of Louisiana citizens or the citizens of District 13, certainly not in the best interests of his constituents. So that doesn't surprise me, the source. Obviously, there's no truth to that. But I'm very, very gratified to hear about the poll. I'm also gratified to hear about the fact that you're not letting off the gas. You're continuing to move forward, continuing to bring out the issues. But I'm sure you must feel emboldened and optimistic about at least getting a good preliminary poll result.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, I've been winning for the past, I guess, 3 months when the first poll that I saw, and those poll numbers just continue to go up. And that's the thing about, we have to get out our message on social media. I hope your listeners will go to my Facebook page and like my Facebook page and go to my website, because there's so much. I mean, we are fighting for, I think, the very soul of America. And that sounds maybe bombastic, but it's really not, because America's on the verge of tyranny. And if we don't push back against that and have people who are willing to stand up to fight for freedom, then we could possibly, like Ronald Reagan said, that freedom is just one generation away from extinction, that we have to fight for it. And
Yes.
That's one of the things that drives me. And so, you ask about the constituents and their concerns. I think we've got to do something about we've got to create more jobs, and we're going to do that by lowering taxes on businesses and continue to fight for that. We've got so many things going for us in Louisiana, and we just need to optimize that. And I believe our next governor will do that, and our legislature will do that.
Yeah. And while we have you, Valarie, I know you have to run, but there's one question we've been asking every candidate that comes on, and you spoke just a moment ago about tyranny. We've been hearing a lot of rumors about a new COVID variant and that the feds may want to mask us and lock us down again. What's your position on that, and what would you do as a state senator to help protect the people of Louisiana from any future lockdowns or mandates?
Well, that's something that you talk about a track record. I can show you where I started writing letters in April of 2020 to the governor to open our state back up, because it's not the government's place to tell you when you can go to church and when you have to stay home, and when you can go to work or you have to stay home, and close schools. That was a very traumatizing time, especially for children.
Yeah.
And for adults as well, who ended up not being able to go to work, lost their businesses. We saw an increase in suicides. We saw an increase in drug abuse, and because of that. So I fought for day one to open back the state, and we just could not get enough signatures. I wrote letters. We had then, Representative Kathy Edmondson and I wrote letters together, and then our numbers grew. We had 10 people, then we had 28 people, but we never could get to that number to say we are going to end this executive order, because it is overreach. First it was 2 weeks to slow the spread. So, we went along with that because we really didn't know what the effects were going to be. But then the 2 weeks turned into months and months, and you just can't sustain that an economy can't sustain that.
No.
And then when I saw other states that, like Florida, what they were doing, but we could not get that done because we had a legislature that was too weak to stand up to the governor and sign the petition to override that. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping we can do if I get in as this next senator for Livingston Parish, that we'll have enough senators who will stand, and we can come together and we can fix that. Under a declared emergency, the governor has that power, but in 30 days is enough. We see that when we have hurricanes and things like that. But just to extend it month after month after month after month. And the reason they were extending it was that, well, we're getting federal money. Well, we're not in the business to get federal money. I mean, that's ultimately our tax money.
Yeah.
That's coming back to us. And So we definitely need to address that. I have heard some rumblings about another lockdown to vaccine mandates. That's just the mass mandates. We cannot endure that again. I don't think people will tolerate that. And so if you look at my Facebook, I've got the letters that I wrote to President Trump, the letters that I wrote to John Bel Edwards, the letters that we tried to get petitions signed. And I fought that in 2020 and we'll fight that again. Am fighting that. So hopefully we're not going to have to, we won't have that. I think they understand the people are not going to comply with that again.
Yeah, and we've been very, very vocal about the rumors that we've heard and about encouraging our listeners to take action and just not comply. And we have to remember, Valarie, that there are far more of us than there are of them. The radical left does not want us to realize how much we all have in common, even how much we have in common with Democrats on a number of critically important issues. We've got great things in common. But you're right. We had the numbers in the legislature, the Republican numbers, to revoke that emergency declaration. It required, I think, 54 votes in the legislature to do that. And unfortunately, there were just too many rhinos, including, quite frankly, your opponent. And I applaud the fact that you're very, very positive and that you're not in the business of saying negative or disparaging things about your opponent. And I congratulate you for that and I applaud it. But the fact of the matter is, not only was he not supportive of reopening this state and giving some relief to Louisiana citizens, he undermined the effort. And it's documented that he undermined that effort and actually expressed his outrage and offense that his constituents would be demanding that he take some action to relieve their suffering. In my opinion, that there is nothing that more emphasizes the contrast between you and your opponent than the way each of you responded to that extraordinarily distressing time in our history. When we were all locked down, wondering what we were going to do and how we were going to survive. I think that really does cast in stark contrast the two of you.
That's what I was going to say. I have family members that live in that district who were just constantly calling and emailing, and there was no response ever about that. And because, anyway, I like you said, Chris, I don't want to be disparaging. I want to talk about my accomplishments, what I did, and I think people know what he is. It's not even about what he did, it's what about he didn't do. And we have got to stand up when you realize that the federal government is overstepping their boundaries, that our founding fathers set up a beautiful system called the Constitution to where states' rights can stop that.
Yeah.
And I think as one of the things that, I'm excited about as you go through the process, you get more experience and you learn that there are things people are just like, just shaking their head and saying, well, we can't, there's nothing we can do about that. That's the federal government, but we can do a lot on a statewide level if you just have the right people in office. And I believe we can push back against some of these terrible things that have been implemented and who knows what they're planning on doing. But, I think it's kind of odd that they're talking about having another lockdown or vaccine or whatever, a lockdown at the elections coming up.
Exactly.
And to create confusion. And so we're not going to comply.
We have to not comply.
Yeah, we have to not comply. That's exactly right, Danielle. And I have a very hard time believing that the timing of this is coincidental. I do not believe that the timing is coincidental. But it's gratifying to know, Valarie, that you're prepared to stand up and to do what's necessary to fight for the people if something like that does occur again. Because quite frankly, I don't see how our state survives it if it happens again. So hopefully it won't. As of now, there are no emergency decrees in place, and hopefully it will stay that way. I know our listeners and LCAG supporters, State of Freedom supporters, are reaching out in significant numbers to our leaders and telling them in advance, we're not complying with any lockdowns, any health protocols, or any such thing anymore. So don't even try it. So they're acting very preemptively, and we're very happy to see that.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I want to mention before I go is at the end of session, and Chris, I know you guys have talked about this, about not busting the cap and not increasing the spending limit for the state, that we've gone from 27, I think it's about 27 billion to $46.5 billion increase in our budget since in the last 8 years. And so when we had that, it was 1.5 or 1.6 billion. That, we were told, if you don't vote for this to bust the cap, then you're gonna get your projects cut. And a lot of people went along with it, but except for 19 people said we're not going to do that. That's taxpayer money. We need to pay down debt. There's other things that we can do with it. And so I got my project cut. I had a project. It was the northern part of the Amite River to detain and retain water during a flood that would build a system of weirs in the northern part of the Amite River, a little bit above me in St. Helena. And I had $2 million for that project to get started on the engineering. And so they cut that project because I voted no to not increase the spending limit. And they cut my roundabouts and other projects that I had in the budget. So that's what it gets tough, because you have to say, am I going to stand on principle and do the right thing and suffer the consequences, or I'm just going to go along to get along? And that's what we've got to have a change in our legislature to stop doing that kind of thing. We cannot afford to raise taxes. I mean, how can you sustain a $46 billion budget is not sustainable. And that's what hopefully our next governor and our legislature can look at that and start making some changes.
Absolutely. It's especially not sustainable when people are fleeing the state because of the price of taxes.
Right. And businesses won't come here because of that. And so we just need to create a better business climate. I believe our next governor will do that. And we're going to have conservatives who absolutely refuse to go along with any tax increases. And we can start rolling back some of the things that we need to do on that.
On that issue, Valarie, and then Danielle may want to close it out with you and let you go. But I want to ask a final question on this. A number of states, speaking of taxes and the incredible tax burden Louisiana citizens face, a number of states have abolished the state income tax altogether. And contrary to having a negative consequence from that, those states are actually thriving economically, prospering significantly. What are your thoughts on, at some point, abolishing the state income tax altogether?
Well, we've heard talk about that. And at first glance, I think I would support that, because it is what Texas and Florida and Tennessee have done, and it's working for them. We have to look at, though, how we're going to offset the loss of income that we'll have for that. But I do think it's a good idea. We just have to make changes in other places, and I believe that'll bring businesses here. That will bring other, maybe some of the 200,000 people that we have lost, that have left. We can bring some of them back. So I think it's probably a good idea. It's going to take a lot of work to get it done, though, and hopefully, I don't know if we can get it done the first year next year, but hopefully we will have a plan and can start looking at that.
Great. Well, it's something that I'm hopeful for, certainly. And we know that you have to run. So just quickly, where can people learn more about you? You mentioned your Facebook and website. Can you give us the address for your website?
Yes, it's Valarie Hodges for Senate is the Facebook page. And the website is valariehodgesforsenate.com.
Perfect. We'll get that in the show notes. We'll make sure people know how to find you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Valarie. We wish you certainly all the best.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all that you guys are doing for liberty and for our state. God bless you.
God bless you.
God bless you. Chris, she's one of our favorite warriors. She's done so much. I mean, that foreign adversaries bill, when they bust in the Chinese, and by they, I mean, I guess our opponents, I don't know who they are, but when the Chinese got bussed in for that hearing, it was so remarkable. It was, to talk about people calling you racist, that was the day that racism was being waved as a banner across the state capitol. And she and many of her colleagues stood firm, and we got that bill passed.
Yes, that was a very, very contentious hearing, the initial hearing on that bill before, the Senate committee. It was contentious, and it shouldn't have been, because it's a Republican-controlled committee.
It shouldn't have been, because it's an issue of state sovereignty. I mean,
Yes.
it shouldn't be contentious at all. If you were a foreign adversary, how do you get into the Capitol? That's what I'd like to know. So you can wave your flag and say, "Don't do this against me." I mean, ridiculous.
Exactly. It is ridiculous. And but she stood strong. You recall, Danielle, that when it first went before the committee, Democrat Jay Luna was able to kill that committee because the chairman of the committee, Republican Chairman Barrow Peacock, didn't stand up
That's right.
and lead that committee. So that bill was killed in the committee initially, and then because of public outrage, they agreed to hear it again, and it went back before. And instead of 150 Chinese filling the seats of that committee room, there was 150 patriotic Americans in there, and they couldn't get it out of there fast enough at that point. So Valerie's a real fighter. You're exactly right. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, I don't see two candidates in any race that we're following and supporting candidates in, where the two candidates are more polar opposites than in this race, than Valarie Hodges and her opponent, the Rhino Buddy Mincy. I mean, they are polar opposites.
They are. And you had alluded to it, Chris, earlier when Valarie was on, but in the 2020 COVID lockdowns where she stood up and she was writing letters and she was very responsive to constituent concerns and had her own concerns as a constitutional conservative, she went forward and she was doing things, and she was part of that group that was really trying to reopen the state. But Buddy Mincy, her opponent, he wasn't silent like some legislators who we've talked about. Instead, he was very vocal, but it seemed he was vocal to his colleagues. He was antagonistic toward the petition that Alan Seabaugh brought, and he was even upset, apparently, by the number of calls he received from concerned constituents who I guess maybe he forgot were his voters, his voting base.
Absolutely, Danielle. You make a very good distinction between rhinos who simply were silent because they were too weak to speak up, and rhinos who actively undermined the effort to get this state reopened. And Valarie Hodges' opponent, Buddy Mincy, falls into the latter category. I happen to have come across an email that Buddy sent to his Republican colleagues, the Republican delegation, at the height of the COVID lockdown, when we had been locked down for months in this state, an email from July 3rd, 2020 to his colleagues saying that, I'm sorry, folks, but we have bigger issues to fight, and nobody should be pressuring members of our delegation to conform and sign the Seabaugh petition. Enough is enough. Stop with encouraging the masses to either intimidate or pressure our members to conform. That is an email from Representative Buddy Mincy. Well, we have news for you, Buddy. You represent constituents who elected you. Your responsibility is to represent and stand up for their concerns, not to express your anger or your annoyance that your constituents are putting pressure on you to stand up for the citizens and help reopen this state. And I'd like to know, while we're at it, Representative Mincy, if you can answer this question. In July 3rd of 2020, when you said, we have bigger issues to fight, what were the bigger issues that you were fighting, Buddy Mincy? The legislative session was not in session. It was in July. What were you doing that took priority over fighting hard for your citizens to reopen the state and to revoke that emergency lockdown? I'd like to know what the bigger issues were that you were working on, Buddy, because this is, to me, absolutely reprehensible that you would undermine that effort that way and put in writing your resentment that your constituents simply expect you to do your job.
In writing to the entire Republican delegation, as I understand it. And Chris, he went even further and said that he wanted the social media posts by third-party groups who were attacking the non-signers of this petition to be taken down. So not only is he upset because they are calling him, pressuring him, he's also worried that they're attacking him, believing that if he doesn't do what they want him to do, he's receiving that as an attack, not as a concerned constituent request or even demand.
Exactly. And as Representative Alan Seabaugh appropriately responded, Buddy, when your constituents make demands on you and express their concerns to you and ask you to stand up for them, That is not an attack, buddy. That is not an attack. And it's time to put your, quote, big boy pants on.
I really love that. I love that. Big boy pants are needed.
Big boy pants are needed, and unfortunately, Representative Mincy did not do that. But it's just very important to point out the contrast between the way he responded to that lockdown and the way Representative Valarie Hodges responded.
Yes, and if there is a way for us to put that email out, we will absolutely be trying to do that, but give us some time to figure it out. And beyond Chris believing that the legislature had bigger fish to fry than COVID in July of 2020, last year, long after the truth was coming out about the damage of the COVID shots, he voted against protecting citizens from future mandates of experimental vaccines.
He absolutely did. And one of the bills that he voted against on the House floor was a bill that simply says, okay, you're going to try to mandate vaccines on citizens. Well, how about this? Let's make a compromise here. If we don't have the right to sue the manufacturer of a vaccine that harms a citizen, that causes significant problems with citizens, myocarditis, all kinds of physical problems that this vaccine COVID shot's causing. If we can't sue the manufacturer for those problems, and guess what? You don't get to mandate it anymore in the state of Louisiana. It seems very clear-cut, very equitable, and a very just piece of legislation in 2022. Well, Buddy Mincy opposed that, voted against that legislation on the House floor.
Unbelievable. So, unconstitutional mandates, which are not law, were not outlawed because of the vote of Buddy Mincy and others who sided with Big Pharma instead of their constituents, instead of the people of this state. And Buddy Mincy also clearly believes that educators and public bureaucrats are better than parents and doctors to make better placed than parents and doctors to make recommendations on medical decisions for children and to make judgment calls about those.
Voted against legislation in 2022 that would have prohibited education bureaucrats and education administrators from making recommendations about vaccines, and would have said that any vaccine recommendation must come from a medical provider, a qualified, trained medical provider who knows a patient and understands their medical history and whether or not a vaccine is appropriate for them. Buddy Mincy opposed that legislation and voted no on the House floor. I don't understand it.
It's really remarkable. And I just can't get over the arrogance of these kinds of votes. And as you and I were talking before the show, Chris, I view this, and I don't know if this is the right term for it, but this is very statist thinking, where you believe that the state and arbiters of the state, employees of the state, are better placed than parents and the actual rightful decision makers to make decisions for children, to make decisions for the people, that the state is in a better position to tell us what to do than we are. And I just can't, I really can't wrap my head around how people get there. But Buddy Mincy is there. And so I, in my mind, call him a statist. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but he also placed himself loudly and squarely on the wrong side of many other issues related to education, related to parental rights, and even state sovereignty.
Yes, and one piece of legislation that, in my opinion, really defines Buddy Mincy's public and legislative philosophy is a bill that he authored last year that would have established a intrastate commerce commission made up of a number of states that come together and form this commission that would be able to determine how Louisiana certifies its teachers, qualifies its teachers, the criteria by which they're qualified to teach, and how Louisiana reciprocates as far as certification of teachers who are coming in from out of state. This legislation would have surrendered Louisiana's sovereign ability to make those critical teacher certification decisions on the altar of this interstate commerce commission that would have had rule-making authority on these critical issues that would have trumped state law. The legislation that he authored in its original form basically said any rules that this commission comes up with and seeks to impose on the member states supersede state law. And that is extraordinarily troubling to me, that he would sponsor legislation that involves a direct compromise of state sovereignty. In fact, Senator Mizell, when this bill got to the Senate Education Committee, told him very directly, Representative Mincy, I'm not inside your head. I don't know your motives, but this legislation in its current form involves a extreme compromise of Louisiana's sovereign ability to make these critical determinations on our own, and puts them and surrenders them in the altar of this compact. Another important provision of this bill is that this commission would have had emergency rule-making authority. If this commission came to the determination, Danielle, that there was some kind of a public health safety question, or that the public safety was an imminent danger, this commission, these 11 or 12 states, could come together and vote on emergency protocols and then impose those protocols on the member states, including Louisiana, despite Louisiana law. It would trump Louisiana law. It just, to me, and there's so many other troubling things about this legislation. For instance, and Danielle, this is something that you brought up earlier, this legislation that he brought. They have the authority, this commission, to lease, purchase land, accept appropriate gifts or donations, sell, convey property, lease, exchange, abandon immovable property, borrow money.
Chris, it's sick.
Borrow money. Danielle, explain to me why this commission that is set up for the simple purpose of establishing a uniform criteria whereby we certify our teachers, qualify our teachers, would need to borrow money.
So a teacher reciprocity program that needs to buy and sell property, that needs to make loans, that needs to be able to accept gifts. I don't understand why that, A, would be in this legislation. B, why would you bring legislation that openly shows that you basically are promoting corruption? Because there's no need for any of that to be in something like this. And I'm so thankful, Chris, that this bill got gutted beyond recognition. And I think, frankly, Buddy Mincy got his butt handed to him by the Senate committee, the Senate Education Committee, namely Senator Mizell. And big thanks to her for that. She just laid it out on the line for him.
She sure did, and this interstate commerce provision of this bill ended up being gutted, fortunately and thankfully. And what you said, Danielle, about the potential for corruption. It specifically says in the legislation that this commission can accept gifts. Who's going to be giving the gifts from any source? George Soros, Bill Gates, other billionaires.
What constitutes a gift?
And what constitutes a gift? It's like, so it's just a recipe for corruption, quid pro quo, self-enrichment. And Buddy Mincy was the author of this. And as you said a minute ago, Danielle, I was so gratified. And quite frankly, it was because of a lot of hard work by a lot of citizens, including LCAG members, including real calls to action that State of Freedom listeners carried out and implemented, that this sinister bill was gutted. So a big shout out of gratitude to all of the CAG members and the State of Freedom listeners who did so much to help kill this horrible piece of legislation.
Yeah, and on the back of that, just think of how ridiculous it is and how offensive that he is going around saying that Valarie hasn't passed any legislation. She passed legislation that protects us from foreign adversaries. He is trying to shove through legislation with some serious, I think, integrity issues on how the legislation was even put forward. And he's doing it at the sacrifice of state sovereignty. So I mean, you couldn't have made a stronger statement about the contrast between these two candidates, Chris.
No question about it. And Representative Mincy, while putting this bill forward originally I believe it was in the Education Committee in the House, suggested that it was Cade Brumley in the Department of Education who had proposed this legislation and brought it to his attention. And I believe that that's one of the reasons why a number of Republicans on the House voted for this, because they were under the impression that Cade Brumley, who was a very good conservative superintendent who really has done some wonderful things, was supporting it. Well, they came out and completely disabused the public of that notion because they did no such thing. So that was a misrepresentation by Representative Mincy in the committee. The last thing that I want to say about this, and this is a very tucked deep into the bill, and it's very sinister to me. It says that while most of the transactions of this commission must occur within public view under the sunlight provisions of our law, they are allowed to negotiate contracts for the purchase of property in executive session, which means that that's on the view of the public. So they're basically negotiating contracts for the buying and selling of property, whose property, by the way, in executive session, so no off limits to the public. Why would they, in this law, put that in executive session, those proceedings?
Yeah, the only thing I can come up with is to hide terrible rulemaking and to hide corruption, because there's no other reason that you would want to be less transparent rather than more transparent on those massive issues.
Yes. And so it's just important that the constituents and the voters out in Senate District 13 understand exactly what you just said, Danielle. While Valarie Hodges was fighting feverishly to reassert and reestablish state and individual sovereignty, Representative Mincy is sponsoring legislation that forfeits and compromises that sovereignty.
Yeah, unbelievable. Unbelievable. And Chris, he went further than that, and he voted to protect bureaucrats and school board members, which are public officials, from the opinions and questions of constituents. And perhaps that's because he does not enjoy getting opinions and questions from constituents himself, so he felt empathy for their position. But what did he do in 2022 to do that?
An item of legislation that was very important, that simply, in a context where parents have become increasingly frustrated about whether or not their school boards and these teachers' unions are listening to them. And by the way, these school boards and teachers' unions are bureaucrats paid by the state, subsidized by the state, and really act antagonistically to the concerns of parents very often. Their job security is not an issue. They can't be fired. And so they're there, and they're not really energetically representing or listening to the concerns of the parents. So this legislation in 2022 would have established one school board meeting per month where any parent could go in and talk about any agenda that was not any topic that was not on the scheduled agenda. One meeting a month, just to make sure that parents had ongoing continued access to their school boards and to their unions so that they could express their concerns. Another thing that the bill would have done, it simply said that if 15 or more parents put in writing a request to place any item on an agenda, then it must be put on an agenda within 60 days of the final written request. Very straightforward piece of legislation that was directly responsive to the parents' frustrations about not being heard by the school boards. Buddy Mincy vocally opposed that legislation, and I'd like an explanation why.
Yeah. I'm not sure that we'll ever get one, Chris, but another bill that he voted against that we probably will not get an explanation for, probably because it is completely indefensible and unexplainable, but he voted against a bill that would have promoted the education on World War II and the Holocaust, I believe in high schools.
This legislation has just deep sentimental attraction to me because my father was a United States Marine. My grandfather was in the military. I know you have family who are in the military, and and when you think about World War II and you think about the heroism of the Allied forces, specifically the American forces, the tremendous valor shown by the Tuskegee Airmen, the Black Air Brigade that fought so heroically in World War II, the Asian American soldiers who fought for our freedom, and how they pulled Europe, the Western civilization, from the grip of what Winston Churchill called the blackest stain to ever appear on the pages of human history, talking about Adolf Hitler. And you think about what contribution those men made during that critical time, and legislation goes forward that would mandate that our high school students are taught World War II, taught the horrors of the Holocaust, taught the unique and extraordinary contribution that so many made on the altar of freedom, and would have given access to all public high school students in Louisiana, free access to the World War II Museum, trips to the World War II Museum, so they could really develop an understanding and appreciation for how costly freedom is. And Buddy Mincy and two other Rhino Republicans voted against that legislation on the House floor. He is in the dubious company of Joe Stagney and Barbara Freiberg in being the only three Republicans to oppose that legislation. And there is no explanation for that. I don't care what he says about that. That is despicable that he would oppose that, but it just goes to show that he is just not knee deep in with the school boards and the teachers unions who do not want to energetically teach and represent the interests of these students. He's waist deep. He's chest deep in bed with them.
Exactly. And Chris, just another point on this bill and the state of our culture, right? I mean, kids are being indoctrinated to believe that social media influencers are heroes, and people who have a certain body type are heroes, and people who have certain clothes are heroes. They're not taught about what true valor is anymore. They're not taught about courage. They're not taught about the sacrifice that was required of these veterans and those who lost their life because of the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. And I guess really people who would vote against something like this and people who would not promote true history being taught in schools, I guess at the end of the day, they just want this generation to be weak and ungrateful and not have their eyes open about the realities of what is possible in this world and even what's going on around us.
I could not have said it better myself. And unfortunately, broad swaths of our society, the younger generation is ignorant, is weak. And there are some wonderful bright spots. There are some very, very fine young Americans out there, but too many are ignorant of our history.
And it's our fault, right? It's our fault.
It is our fault. George Santayana, the great philosopher, said that those who fail to heed the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. Well, how can we heed the lessons of history when we're not studying the events in history where tyranny was fought back due to the courageous actions of freedom-loving patriots? How can they learn those lessons if they're not being taught those lessons? And what better way to learn them and to really absorb them than to attend once or twice a year the World War II Museum in New Orleans? I'll tell you what, that's worth an awful lot. And to vote again, not to beat a dead horse here, Danielle, but to vote against this legislation just tells me an awful lot about the radical extent to which Buddy Mincy is compromised to education bureaucrats, to school boards, and to teachers' unions.
Yeah. I just offer up, I guess, for the listeners and particularly for the voters of Livingston Parish, a high contrast between a woman of integrity and fight, and who believes in the Constitution, who believes in, understanding the causes that were fought for and being able to recognize evil when it's rearing its head right in front of you, and someone who wants our children to be ignorant, who wants the state to make decisions for us. I guess that's where we kind of leave that today, Chris.
Yeah, well, you know what I'm hoping? I'm hoping that Representative Hodges will bring this bill again into the state Senate and get it through. Well, to be honest with you, Danielle, I don't know for sure ultimately whether this passed. I think it passed the House. I'm not sure what happened in the Senate, but clearly we know Representative Mincy opposed it. But if this did not reach ultimate passage, I think it's a top priority to bring it and to get it through with a new conservative governor. What do you say?
Yeah, well, I mean, more than ever, we need our children to understand what Marxism looks like and what the impact of it is, because this is what's staring us in the face right now.
Yeah, a couple of closing points here, Danielle, and then I'll let you close us out here. We've talked before about how when we have guests on the show, very rarely, there's only going to be one episode where any given listener will be voting for, or maybe two, will be voting for either the representative or the Senate candidate that we have on the show. But that doesn't mean that we don't all have an interest and a strong motivation to promote all of these candidates, because we have to remember that what the legislature does collectively affects the entire state. It doesn't just affect a given district or a given demographic. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of our listeners encouraging, all of these candidates and doing everything they can to help and get the word out about all of these candidates, because again, what they do affects us all so profoundly.
Yes, absolutely. Please share these episodes with your friends and family members who live in the districts that these fantastic candidates are representing or aiming to represent. We need as much help as possible getting the word out, and they do need the help as well. And as Valarie mentioned, early voting by mail is starting, so we really, really need to get on top of this. And I think, I guess even on that point, Brandon Trosclair was on, and I think he mentioned to us that he's strongly encouraging us to do day of in-person voting. So that's what I'm going to be aiming to do. That's my plan. I'll carve out the morning to do that. It'll only take a few minutes, but I think, Chris, you and I will also be kind of going through a list of endorsements and doing some calls to action before, on a broader statewide scale whenever we get a little closer to election day on October 14th. But anyway, if you are interested in supporting candidates like Valarie, please consider supporting LCAG. That's www.lacag.org. Any donations that you make there go to support fantastic pro-Constitution conservatives.
And Danielle, also, if people are more comfortable writing a check to the LCAG PAC, and we can put this in the show notes, the address is just LCAG PAC, LACAG PAC, P.O. Box 64952, Baton Rouge, Louisiana 70896. And if you donate to the LCAG PAC, it enhances our resources, enhances our ability to promote and support conservative candidates across the state. It's so very important to do that, and enables us to continue to do our work.
Yes, and if you are loving the State of Freedom, if you have been listening for a little while and appreciate the information and the guests, please consider supporting us as well. It's freedomstate.us. You can just go to the website and there's a tab where you can click on to support us there. So any amount would be helpful. We really appreciate all the support support we've gotten so far. And if you are a patriotic Louisiana First listener and have a business that you would like to promote, please just drop us a note at info@freedomstate.us. We would love to talk to you about advertising with us, getting your business's name out there to more and more people as well.
And we have the ability to promote very enthusiastically business who want to advertise on the State of Freedom. We are rapidly expanding, thousands and thousands across the state. It'd be a privilege to promote such businesses, no question about it. And I want to close out with this, Danielle. We are revolutionizing day by day the way political advocacy is done in Louisiana by providing an increasingly broad platform for Louisiana First constitutional conservative candidates, representatives, and senators to come on and share their vision, share their concerns, share their hopes with freedom-loving constitutional conservatives across the state. And when you have a broad platform that's irresistible, it evens the playing field, it equalizes the playing field, and it enables these candidates and these citizens who've spent most of their lives in the private sector to share their vision to many thousands in one appearance in one episode and get their name out there and get the support they need to win and to do what's necessary to preserve our freedom and our liberty. So that is what is at stake with the State of Freedom. So every dime donated, any advertising done, your subscriptions, your sharing, your listening, it all is advancing the grand cause of freedom. And together each day, we will move forward to preserve the state of freedom in Louisiana.
Amen. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The State of Freedom. To stay on top of all the calls to action we mentioned today, just check out the show notes for the episode. If you'd like to support the show financially, visit our website at freedomstate.us. If you'd prefer to give by mail, you can send a check to the State of Freedom, LLC, at P.O. Box 861, Berg, Louisiana 70343. If you own a business in Louisiana and are interested in supporting our show by advertising, please email us at info@freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org, LACAG.org, or email Chris at chris@lacag.org. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and share it. Give us a 5-star rating in the reviews. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next time.